It started in mud, as many things do. In a normal world, it would have been time for breakfast, but apparently breakfast was not served in hell. The bombardment that had begun before dawn showed no signs of letting up. Private Jonas did not feel much like eating anyway. Except for a brief moment of terrified retreat across a patch of muddy ground, cratered and desolate as the moon, Paul Jonas had spent all of this 24th day of March, 1918, as he had spent the 3 days before, and most of the past several months, crouched, shivering, in cold, stinking slime, somewhere between Ypres and St. Quentin, deafened by the skull-rattling thunder of the German heavy guns, praying reflexively to something in which he no longer believed. He had lost Finch and Mullet and the rest of the platoon somewhere in the chaos of retreat. He hoped they'd made it safely into some other part of the trenches, but it was hard to think about anything much beyond his own few cubits of misery. The entire world was wet and sticky. The torn earth, the skeletal trees, and Paul himself had all been abundantly spattered by the slow-falling mist that followed hundreds of pounds of red-hot metal exploding in a crowd of human beings. Red fog, gray earth, sky the color of old bones. Paul Jonas was in hell. But it was a very special hell. Not everyone in it was dead yet. In fact, Paul noted, one of its residents was dying very slowly indeed. By the sound of the man's voice, he could not be more than 24 yards away. But he might as well have been in Timbuktu. Paul had no idea what the wounded soldier looked like. He could no more have voluntarily lifted his head above the lip of the trench than he could have willed himself to fly. But he was all too familiar with the man's voice, which had been cursing, sobbing, and squealing in agony for a full hour, filling every lull between the crash of the guns. All the rest of the men who had been hit during the retreat had shown the good manners to die quickly, or at least to suffer quietly. Paul's invisible companion had screamed for his sergeant, his mother, and God, and when none of them had come for him, had kept on screaming anyway. He was screaming still, a sobbing, wordless wail. Once a faceless doughboy like thousands of others, the wounded man now seemed determined to make everyone on the Western Front bear witness to his dying moments. Paul hated him. The terrible thumping roar subsided. There was a glorious moment of silence before the wounded man began to shriek again, piping like a boiling lobster. "Got a light?" Paul turned. Pale, beer-yellow eyes peered from a mask of mud beside him. The apparition, crouched on hands and knees, wore a greatcoat so tattered it seemed made from cobwebs. "What? Got a light? A match?" The normality of the question in the midst of so much that was unreal left Paul wondering if he had heard correctly. The figure lifted a hand as muddy as the face, displaying a thin white cylinder so luminously clean that it might have dropped from the moon. "Can you hear, fella? A light?" Paul reached into his pocket and fumbled with numbed fingers until he found a box of matches, miraculously dry. The wounded soldier began howling even louder, lost in the wilderness a stone's throw away. The man in the ragged greatcoat tipped himself against the side of the trench, fitting the curve of his back into the sheltering mud, then delicately pulled a cigarette into 2 pieces and handed one to Paul. As he lit the match, he tilted his head to listen. "God help me, he's still going on up there." He passed the matches back and held the flame steady so Paul could light his own cigarette. "Why couldn't Fritz drop one on him and give us all a little peace?" Paul nodded his head. Even that was an effort. His companion lifted his chin and let out a dribble of smoke which curled up past the rim of his helmet and vanished against the flat morning sky. "Do you ever get the feeling?" "Feeling?" "That it's a mistake." The stranger wagged his head to indicate the trenches, the German guns, all of the Western Front. "That God's away, or having a bit of a sleep or something. Don't you find yourself hoping that one day he'll look down and see what's happening and do something about it?" Paul nodded, although he had never thought the matter through in such detail. But he had felt the emptiness of the gray skies, and had occasionally had a curious sensation of looking down on the blood and mud from a great distance, observing the murderous deeds of war with the detachment of a man standing over an anthill. God could not be watching, that was certain. If he was, and if he had seen the things Paul Jonas had seen, men who were dead but didn't know it, frantically trying to push their spilled guts back into their blouses, bodies swollen and fly-blown, lying unretrieved for days within yards of friends with whom they had sung and laughed. If he had seen all that but not interfered, then he must be insane.